Do you really know the people around you? Maybe you believe you can easily notice when someone is toxic, identify a heavy energy, or realize when a behavior crosses the line. But what if I told you that the real dangers aren't that obvious? That many truly destructive people actually hide behind a mask of friendliness, kindness, and sometimes even family ties. While you stay alert for the obvious villains, you might end up allowing something far subtler and more dangerous to happen. Another person's unconscious silently invading your own. Carl Gustav Jung dove deeply into this hidden territory. In The Ego and the Unconscious, he states that most of what controls our lives is actually beyond our conscious reach. This rule applies to everyone, not just you. And that's where the danger lies. Those who ignore their own darkness end up spreading it without even realizing. And often, the one who absorbs that shadow is you. Maybe you've never thought about this deeply, but reflect. How many times has a conversation left you emotionally exhausted? How many times have you been unfairly blamed or taken on the burden of a pain that wasn't even yours? Jung named this phenomenon projection, when, unconsciously, we project onto others what we fail to work through in ourselves. When this starts happening, you stop being just yourself. You become a symbol, a reflection, an invented villain, or an imagined hero for the other person. The tragedy is that none of these images represents your truth, and, perhaps most dangerously, often you barely notice the role you've been cast in. You might believe you're being generous, understanding, sensible. Without realizing it, you dive into a psychological plot that doesn't belong to you, absorbing other people's problems, taking on pains and conflicts from the outside, getting wrapped up in a web of unconscious manipulation. And this doesn't only happen with ill-intentioned people. Jung was clear. The real danger doesn't lie in the openly evil, but in the unconscious, those who ignore their own shadow. These are people held hostage by traumas, masks, and repressed desires. They aren't inherently evil, but they do represent real risks. And their risk is subtle. It doesn't arrive with advance warning. It creeps in gradually, through details, in indirect words, veiled criticism, heavy silences, until it undermines your self-confidence. Little by little, you begin to doubt your own perception. You start to live under the influence of another's unconscious. This story might be happening right now in your relationship, among your friends, at work, or even at home. If at this moment you feel guilty trying to figure out what you did wrong, know this. It's not your fault. The mistake lies in how you're being used as an unconscious dumping ground. In this video, I will detail the 6 types of people Jung considered emotionally dangerous. People who, driven by hidden forces they don't even understand, end up hurting others without deliberate intent. And that's exactly why these profiles are so devastating. We'll bring Jung's words and concepts, drawn directly from books such as Ion, The Ego and the Unconscious, and Archetypes and the Collective Unconscious, to help you recognize these personalities in detail. More than pointing them out in others, the goal is to prompt an honest look inward. Could part of these profiles also live within you? If you're ready, take a deep breath and follow me. But know this: after this deep dive, your view of others and of yourself will certainly change. Think about what it's like to live with someone who makes you carry the weight of the world, who turns your mere presence into the reason for all their pains, who casts you as the guilty party for feelings you never provoked. At first glance, they seem like sensitive, deep, even fragile people. But over time, you realize you're being sucked into an emotional battlefield that doesn't belong to you, and where, inevitably, you start off at a disadvantage. This is the unconscious manipulator. Someone unaware of their own wounds and, without meaning to, dumps their conflicts onto those nearby as a form of survival. Jung warns, what we do not face in ourselves, we will meet as fate. Many times, this fate has a name, a face, and even lives with you daily. The unconscious manipulator is dominated by traumas, repressed emotions, and unresolved pain. Rather than turning inward, they project everything onto those around them, making others a canvas for their internal dramas, and turning the surrounding life into a scene of continuous projection. According to Jung, projection is inevitable for the human mind, but when we don't recognize this mechanism, it turns into a weapon against ourselves and others. In The Ego and the Unconscious, Jung explains that projection produces psychic blindness. We start seeing others not as they are, but as symbols of our own internal gaps. This is how the unconscious manipulator acts. They don't see you, but what they have lost or fear within themselves. These people tend to adopt the role of victim. If something goes wrong, it's never their fault. If they feel anger, you triggered it. Sadness, you hurt them. Insecurity, you made yourself seem superior. It's a subtle distortion, so invisible that you begin to doubt yourself. Was I too harsh? Am I insensitive? Did I make a mistake? The manipulation settles in without a single harsh word. Everything happens on an emotional plane, through coded communication, in loaded silence. And it works. Most dangerously, many of these people are magnetic, full of sensitivity and intensity. This creates a trap. You believe you can help them, that you'll manage to reach that blind spot no one else has seen. In the effort to save them, you end up sacrificing your own mental and energetic health, all for someone who doesn't want or isn't able to look inward. The more you try, the more ensnared you become in this prison. Jung warns, projections doom us to symbolic roles of hero, villain, father, mother, or enemy, everything except ourselves. And to live like this is to exist in a chronic illusion, condemned to serve as a mirror for others' shadows. The main defense against the unconscious manipulator is awareness. Observe the patterns, identify the dynamics that repeat, and don't be afraid to cut the invisible ties that bind you to the other's emotional narrative. Constantly ask yourself, does this feeling really belong to me, or am I carrying something that isn't mine? It's important to understand, the unconscious manipulator doesn't invade your life aggressively. They slip in silently, taking advantage of your empathy and your tendency to want to help. Recognizing this mechanism, the next step is to spot an even more refined trap, the persona. This is about the person who not only projects, but invests so much energy in appearing to be something they're not that they lose themselves in the role. Next, let's dive into the world of the persona and understand why it represents one of the most complex psychological risks highlighted by Jung. While the unconscious manipulator projects their conflicts onto you, the bearer of the persona is able to drag you into an unreal reality where you can even forget your true identity. If you're enjoying this content, subscribe and support our channel. Thank you for your support. It is essential to remember that some of the most serious psychological dangers don't come from obvious attitudes, but from what seems too perfect, from the flawless smile, the irreproachable posture, the seemingly faultless image. We live in an age of appearances where being matters less than seeming. Jung saw this as a major problem. Those who identify completely with this social mask, the persona, end up disconnected from their own essence. And in this process, not only do they lose themselves, but they also begin to distort the perceptions of everyone around them. Jung wrote in The Ego and the Unconscious that the persona is not who someone really is, but what they and the world believe them to be, an artificial creation shaped by the demands of society, family, and work. The persona itself isn't something negative. We all need it to navigate social roles, professional, friend, child, partner. The danger arises when someone comes to believe they are only this facade, when the mask sticks to the face and everything that is genuine, vulnerable, and unique is gradually relegated to the basement of the mind. The bearer of the persona is a specialist in pleasing, in keeping the surface calm. They say what pleases, do what is expected, avoid any and all tension. But behind this flawless performance, there is a growing emptiness. The greater the effort to sustain the image, the higher the internal cost, the suffocation of the true self. This repression comes at a high cost sooner or later. Those who live with someone like this can feel it. Relationships seem cold, robotic, lacking in truth. There is an absence of spontaneity, of depth. Everything seems calculated. The most unsettling part, the bearer of the persona projects onto others their own desire for perfection. They expect you to join the game as well, to follow the script, maintain composure, fit into the ideal narrative. Authentic displays of emotion or vulnerability provoke discomfort, withdrawal, even rejection. Jung already warned, this extreme identification with the persona is one of the greatest threats to personal development and the integration of the unconscious. The real danger is living hypnotized by this role, confusing yourself with what others expect and never daring to be authentic. Thus, the prison of the facade is born. Everything that is alive and authentic ends up being suffocated under the smooth, artificial surface. Living with this kind of person can be suffocating. You start watching yourself, filtering your spontaneity, hiding what you feel to adapt to the artificial environment. Without realizing it, you start putting on masks too. Living near a bearer of the persona is to submerge into artificiality. This pattern is like an emotional virus, but there is an even darker aspect. When feelings and desires are repressed for too long, they don't dissolve. They accumulate until they form a powerful shadow. Here, we enter a minefield. The emotions that once denied return with destructive intensity. Next, let's talk about the owner of the repressed shadow, the one who denies their own darkness until they are consumed by it. People who always live in control, in supposed moderation, always acting as expected, never allowing themselves to make mistakes. But behind the impeccable appearance, they harbor chaos on the verge of erupting. What is seen as wrong or shameful is pushed to the bottom of the psyche. It doesn't disappear. It simply waits for the moment to emerge. This is the owner of the repressed shadow, someone who pursues an ideal of light so much that they become a target of their own shadow. Jung examines this dynamic closely. In Ion, he states, the shadow consists of everything that we refuse to acknowledge about ourselves, but which remains present. Impulses, envy, anger, all are repressed but never eliminated. Little by little, the internal pressure grows until there is a loss of control. Living with people like this is living with the unpredictable. You never know when balance will fall apart. Often, this repression is fueled by a sense of moral superiority, by rigid values that turn guilt into a tool for control. And so, we move towards the next profile, the moralistic controller, who, besides repressing themselves, wants to control you through guilt. In the next section, let's uncover one of the characters most harmful to inner growth, according to Jung, the moralistic controller. They personify the guardian of virtue, the one who hides their own conflicts behind a mask of perfection. Not every executioner brandishes visible threats. Some wield crosses, ethical discourses, rigid rules, and platitudes as weapons. They claim to act in the name of morality and the common good. But behind the facade, they imprison themselves and others in a prison of guilt and shame. Jung identified in this archetype one of the most subtle forms of psychic oppression, the use of morality as a mask. The moralistic controller does not integrate their own shadow, but projects it violently onto others, punishing that which they cannot tolerate in themselves. You've probably come across people like this, those who judge, demand, and point out flaws, but never turn their gaze inward. The stage of judgment is, in fact, a strategy to maintain the illusion of superiority. As Jung explained, the greater the internal repression, the more intense the compulsion to condemn others. This is the playbook of the moralistic controller, turning those around them into heretics, transgressors, wrongdoers, just to avoid confronting their own shadows. Unlike the classic manipulator, they believe they're acting nobly, correcting and saving. Precisely because of this, their impact is perverse. It is steeped with authority, good intentions, and even spirituality. Their criticisms and repressions come adorned with justifications such as, "It's for your own good," or "Someone needs to warn you." But this supposed truth is distorted. It's a reflection of what they themselves refuse to integrate. In the book Aeon, Jung extensively explores the archetypes of Christ and the Antichrist as symbolic representations of psychic wholeness and fragmentation. The moralistic controller believes they are embodying the light, but they do so at the cost of completely denying their own shadow. They project evil onto others to maintain the illusion of inner purity. This mechanism blinds them to their own humanity and makes them dangerous to those around them. If you have this kind of person constantly in your life, it's common to feel eternally inadequate or guilty even when you're just being yourself. You live under judgment. Everything is watched, everything is weighed, and over time, this external gaze turns into self-censorship. You begin to repress precisely the most lively and human parts of yourself in the name of a standard that isn't genuinely yours. Someone else's morality becomes your prison. This scenario is typical of families, religious groups, and strict environments, where following rules becomes synonymous with virtue. Jung warned, this moralism suffocates individuation, blocking true self-knowledge. Where excessive rules reign, acceptance of the shadow is lacking. The focus of the radical moralist is not on the pursuit of truth, but of domination. When they can't control others, they try to shape those around them from the inside. But the moralist isn't the only one guided by the unconscious. There is an even more unpredictable type, the complex-ridden. While the moralist invests in repression and projection, the complex-ridden person is driven by unrecognized, unconscious content, acting as if dominated by it. In the next section, we will enter this explosive territory where unresolved traumas and emotions take control and consciousness loses its grip. Imagine living with someone who oscillates between affection and hostility. Today, affectionate. Tomorrow, withdrawn or dominated by anger. What begins as a compliment can easily turn into criticism. A harmless joke becomes a provocation, and a simple gesture of care is suddenly viewed with suspicion. No matter how hard you try to get it right, you're always treading on unstable ground, at the mercy of sudden mood swings. This is the reality for those who share life with someone trapped by unconscious complexes. For Jung, complexes are autonomous, centers of emotion and memory that reside in the unconscious and can unexpectedly take over consciousness. They act like small internal personalities, products of traumas, old wounds, and unprocessed experiences. In works like Psychological Types and The Ego and the Unconscious, Jung shows how these complexes directly affect behavior, making the individual react to the past, not the present. Often, a casual comment triggers an old wound, abandonment, rejection, or unhealed humiliation, and it's those nearby who pay the price. The person under the control of a complex is not even aware. They think they're reacting to the present, but they are merely reliving unprocessed emotions, and the cycle is erratic. Emotional outbursts alternate with remorse, affection, or moments of rationality, creating an unpredictable and confusing relationship. You begin to believe these outbursts are just exceptions. There are days when being together is delightful. That's what makes it so much harder to walk away. There are moments of genuine connection, spontaneous affection, harmony, but inevitably, they are interrupted by unpredictable turnarounds. Emotional storms so intense you can barely understand where they came from. Hoping to restore balance, you adjust yourself, hide, shrink your own essence. You start avoiding delicate conversations, weighing each of your words, altering your own behavior in an attempt not to wake up the sleeping monster in the other person. But here is the hard truth. That monster is not awakened by you. It already exists inside, ready to act. The smallest reason is enough for it to erupt and consume everything around it. According to Jung, non-integrated complexes take over the psyche, becoming the masters of your thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. In a person dominated by complexes, these forces operate repeatedly. They may be complexes of inferiority, guilt, abandonment, persecution, each bringing its own stories, fears, pressures. The more you try to please and appease, the more you reinforce the illusion that it's possible to control something that was never under your control. To live beside such a person is to remain in constant alertness. There is no real emotional security because the present is always invaded by ghosts from the past. And inevitably, you start to absorb that burden. You begin to question your perception, your memory, even your feelings. Without realizing it, you are being captured by the other's unconscious. As surprising as it may seem, perhaps the greatest danger is also the quietest. While those with complexes create chaos, there are others who simply absorb everything around them, subtly draining your joy, your hope, your energy. Now we will talk about the psychic vampire, the one whose presence leaves you exhausted and you don't even know why. We close this cycle with them and present, based on Jung, the true way out of this invisible prison. There are people who don't seek your company, but rather what you have most precious, your psychic energy. They don't impose. They gradually win you over, with dependency disguised as fragility, with never satisfied expectations, with veiled demands and endless needs. Jung, even without using the term, clearly describes this pattern as that of 6 symbiotic relationships, those that dissolve the self and prevent the development of autonomy. In the texts, the ego and the unconscious, and Ion, he warns about the danger of bonds where one lives in the shadow of the other, sucking what they cannot produce in themselves. The psychic vampire feeds on your support, your care, your ongoing empathy. But behind the request is a bottomless void, impossible to fill. You start by giving up small things, and before you notice, you give your very essence, until you can no longer distinguish between your needs and those of the other person. This exhaustion is existential. It is not just the body, it is the soul that is drained. Jung already warned about emotionally dependent people who need to draw energy from others to survive. As harsh as it may be, this is the dynamic of many relationships. The psychic vampire doesn't want to evolve only to be sustained, emotionally, energetically, existentially. The real risk is not just the fatigue, but the slow disappearance of who you are. Gradually, feeling the need for space or silence makes you feel guilty. Setting boundaries turns into selfishness. Wanting distance seems cold, because this type knows how to twist everything. From victim, they become the accuser. From fragile, they become the manipulator. When you realize it, you are living to avoid conflict, to avoid breaking a silent pact that only drains and extinguishes you. Jung points to the only real way out: bring the shadow to light, that is, make the unconscious conscious, not only in the other, but in yourself. Because at any moment anyone can play any of these roles: vampire, complex-ridden, bearer of the persona. It is part of what makes us human. No one is immune. We all carry pain. We all project. The crucial point lies in who chooses to shed light on their own shadow instead of letting it rule their life. This video was an invitation to that honest gaze, a mirror to reveal the patterns that imprison us. If you've made it this far, it means you are ready to take the next step, to recognize and begin to free yourself. And that is genuine freedom. Not eternally blaming others, but taking, for yourself, the power to change your own story. I want to hear about your experience. Write in the comments which profiles have crossed your path and which ones you recognize in yourself. Your honesty can light the way for others. Before we finish, a warning. The next video is a key part of this journey. In it, we'll dive even deeper into self-knowledge. Don't miss it, because knowledge is light, and the more light, the less shadow. See you there.